In order to move better into the oceanic uncertainty, I'm going to introduce our first keynote speaker. She is one of the most influential voices working today at the intersection of philosophy of design and technological futures. A transdisciplinary theorist, she is reader in design and techno-digital future at the Central St. Martin's University of the Arts, London, specially appointed professor at the Tokyo Institute of Technology and founder of the Hybrid Futures Lab, a research initiative exploring the intersection of philosophy, design, technology, and future-making practices. Over the past decade, her work has challenged deterministic understanding of innovation and technological progress, opening critical spaces for uncertainty, ambiguity, speculation, and alternative ways of engaging with the future. What makes her contribution particularly distinctive to me is her ability to translate a complex philosophical concept into question that speaks directly to designers, researchers, and practitioners. Drawing on thinkers such as Bergson, Deleuze, Whitehead, and Stengers, she has developed a body of work that invites us to rethink our relationship with the technology, anticipation, and the unknown. These trajectories culminates in her latest book, The Power of Maybes, Machine Uncertainty and the Design of Futures, which argues that uncertainty should not be treated as a deficit to overcome, but as a vital resource for imagination. Against a world increasingly organized through prediction, optimization, and algorithmic control, the book reclaims ambiguity, hesitation, and not knowing as condition for thinking and acting otherwise. This question resonates deeply with the theme of Anticipation 2026. Today, with a keynote entitled Thinking Backwards, Stitching Breach of Time, Reclaiming Uncertainty, please join me in welcoming Professor Betti Marenko.
Hi, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm so delighted to have been invited to share some of my work. And I know I'm amongst friends, and thanks, Carrie, for that reminder. And actually, it's an honor to be the first keynote. I also want to say, Carrie, you mentioned something about geeky interest in ontology, time, and change. So I think I belong to that group, and I'm delighted I have the opportunity to share some of my thinking. So that's the title of my talk. Thinking backwards, stitching the breach of time, reclaiming uncertainty. My argument today is that we cannot even begin to think about anticipation or futures without first reassessing how we understand uncertainty. And futures, for me, speak to the challenges of moving into unknown tomorrows without imposing today's or yesterday's script of what those futures should be. And someone has printed this sentence just outside. Thank you. So when we talk about futures, what we really talk about is the uncertain, no matter how much planning, forecasting, or anticipating we do. So to start from uncertainty becomes especially urgent under contemporary regime of algorithmic governmentality, where predictive systems increasingly organize life by capturing potential and funneling openness into probabilistic trajectories, ultimately eroding uncertainty. And that's why, for me, uncertainty is the battleground of today. Not something to manage or to smooth away, but a vital resource for resistance. And so to rethink what uncertainty is, how we conceptualize it, how we experience it, becomes a way not only of reimagining our relationship with machines, but to reclaim an otherwise of lived time experience. So today I'm going to speak about the uncertain flow of time about the predictive machines that capture it, about the habits of thoughts that make us misunderstand the time and the realm of the possible, and about how those habits can be dismantled if we want to reclaim a more uncertain and therefore richer existence. And perhaps sort of surprisingly, maybe for an audience concerned with futures, I'm going to do this not by looking forward, but by looking into the past, to a philosopher who was writing at the beginning of the 20th century, Henri Bergson. Now, my talk is divided in two parts. I'm going to start talking about algorithmic governmentality and uncertainty, and the second will present some ideas, curated ideas selected from the corpus of Henri Bergson, in particular his notion of time, possibility, and then I'm going to use his ideas around attention to bring everything back together. So, my argument, which is also a wager, is that we cannot even think about uncertainty without engaging with algorithmic governmentality. And that's what I discuss at length in my book, that an allyship with uncertainty is not only possible, but necessary to resist algorithmic governmentality. This is the paradox we live in today. The paradox in which we are told that we live in unprecedentedly uncertain times, but at the same time, uncertainty is constantly reduced, captured, and controlled. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this paradox in a moment. This is the realm of planetary computation, the most intense process of artificialization of intelligence that human history has ever seen, as philosopher Luciana Parisi has written. In this regime, what counts as knowledge has been reconfigured by intelligent machines of prediction. The automation of decision-making has become a mode of governance based on the notion that data are neutral, computation is objective, and their computed outcomes coincide with reality. Tiziana Terranova calls this the corporate platform complex, the privately owned worldwide infrastructure that has brought together technologies of communication and computation, connection and calculation in unprecedented ways. Now, the operation of the corporate platform complex are designed to be extractive because they extract value from human and non-human resources, attention, labor, sleep time, eyeballs, life itself. They are predatory because they are driven by stakeholder capitalism imperative to grow profit, and they are pathogenic because their byproduct is endemic malaise. The result is that with the stimulus-reward mechanism in full operation that monetizes every aspect of our lived experience, uncertainty is constrained into predictable grooves that capture my potential, preempt my behaviors, and foreclose my futures. As uncertainty gets seized, ambiguity is eroded, and existence is impoverished. But now the question is, what is uncertainty exactly? How do you relate it to uncertainty? If you're like me, probably with a mix of anxiety and curiosity, some logical thinking, but also some apprehension, some fatalism, and some rage. But perhaps, and that's where things get a little bit more interesting, also with longing, with desire, with wonder, and with the willingness to be surprised. So I invite you to think about the words, the images, the metaphors that you're drawn to when you think about uncertainty. Because matters of language are not secondary. The images I used to think with create words. They are the figurations that scaffold my reality. I hear uncertainty often described as void, as lack of information, lack of knowledge, lack of certainty, as blindness, obstructed vision, fog, blur, or a black hole. All these expressions signal the lack of something, not enough knowledge, not enough information, but also powerlessness, inability to decide, to make a move, to choose, leading to anxiety, fear, paralysis. And that's why uncertainty has a bad reputation. It is something to be wary of, to wish away, to manage and to contain. It is synonym with everything that makes life unstable and precarious. All those events and contingencies beyond our control. And of course, yes, uncertainty is all these things. But I would argue that there are other aspects of uncertainty lurking that we wanted to access to make our life more interesting and richer. And certainly my book is not a manual on how to tame it. So, in the simplest terms, uncertainty has to do with not knowing, especially when I don't know what might or might not happen. So it can be defined as the byproduct of imperfect information, when information is incomplete and asymmetrical, when I don't know whether something is true or false, and when I know that I don't know enough. And this is epistemic uncertainty. It has to do with the knowledge, with the limits of my knowledge. It is subjective, can be measured. Uncertainty around the predictability of outcomes, for instance, when we toss a coin, is aleatory or statistical uncertainty. But all uncertainty tend to have an element of subjectivity. And eventually differences between aleatory and subjective uncertainty tends to dissipate. Now, ontological uncertainty is where things get a little bit more intriguing. It's about things that are said to be indeterminate in themselves and concern states or changes of states that are said to be independent from an external observer. So the key distinction here seems to be between epistemic uncertainty, when I don't know about something, and ontological uncertainty, when variability is inherent to a system. However, even the question of whether uncertainty is epistemic or ontological, whether it's more about what I don't know or about something that is inherently unknowable, eventually loses traction. The indeterminate and the indeterminable are not mutually exclusive, so what matters is not how they differ, but how they connect, which is all what quantum physics is about, but I'm not going to talk about that. And something that perhaps you've already picked up is that there are so many adjacent terms that we use to deal with uncertainty. There is vagueness, when the exact meaning of something cannot be determined. And it's not possible to distinguish between the unknowable and the unknown. And there is also ambiguity, when more than one meaning can be assigned to something, resulting in competing meanings. Now, one way of responding to uncertainty is by framing it as risk. And this is the approach found in a lot of social sciences, economics, statistics, and of course the insurance sector. Now, risk is the general term for unwanted and negatively perceived events, and for the calculation of the probability of these unwanted events. It expresses the present calculation of a future uncertainty. It indicates in mathematical terms the statistical probability and the costing of the worst possible outcome. But no matter how objective, scientific, and accurate the assessment of a certain given situation is, it will always be informed by what in that given legal, financial, economical context is perceived as risk. In other words, there is no risk assessment, and therefore no risk per se, without context. Sociologist Gerda Reed puts it very well and bluntly when she says, there is no such thing as risk in the world, only dangers we construct in our head. This means that risk is not an intrinsic property of things or something autonomous, It is always contextual. So perhaps it's more correct to talk about a cognitive frame when we talk about risk, rather than a real phenomenon that I experience directly. Now, this matters because the extent to which the quantification of a future contingency, my perception of risk, becomes a guide for present anticipatory action, that's what really matters. In other words, how I perceive risk reveals how I see my future, and therefore it shapes my present as well. So from this initial consideration, we can say, first of all, that risk and uncertainty are not the same thing. Uncertainty cannot be measured, calculated, or insured, but risk can. If risk is the eventuality that something bad might happen, what I experience is not risk per se, but my knowledge of its contextually constructed calculation. So risk has to do with knowing, not with being. Risk is epistemic, not ontological. And this leads to the familiar paradox that the more information and knowledge we have, the more uncertainty seems to grow, which is the situation we inhabit now. High perception of uncertainty, while algorithmic systems preempt decision-making, and that's the realm of algorithmic governmentality. The regime of automated reason that relies on calculating machines of prediction to foreclose futures. The statistical governance of the real that feeds on the potential dimension of human existence and whose anticipatory modes of interfacing with the world replaces causality and erodes uncertainty. And this word governmentality, like probably most of you know, comes directly from Michel Foucault, who created this word in the late 70s by combining the word government and the word rationality, and to describe a type of government enacted through rational and systematic approach to the management of people and things. And this comes out of Foucault's analysis of types of government. So it's also useful to see what he describes as government, the right disposition of things arranged so as to lead to a convenient end. So governmentality concerns precisely with all the tactics to manage things to a convenient end, but based on systems of classification and calculation. So governmentality is intimately bound up with statistics. And it is indeed the advent of statistics as a science that paved the way for today's regime of algorithmic governmentality. But what makes this regime so unique is not the fact that calculation is at its core, but that for the first time in history, calculation has become automated. And we know how this works because this is our lived experience. Algorithmic governmentality designs my tendencies for living, for being, and for existing. It deploys the automation of automation to hijack my propensities before they become manifest. Its new normal rationality turns contingency, what may be, into discrete chunks of controlled experiences, what will be. So my lived experience is captured. The time dedicated to hesitation, reflection, pause, hesitancy, ambiguity, all the maybes tend to dissipate. What I may or not do, what I may or not be, my potential, becomes instead what I will do, what I will be, now giving us the only possible mode of actualization. And this computational redistribution, capture and redistribution of my sensibility, my affect, my potential, happens not simply before I register this mechanism at the conscious level, but below the threshold of human sentience. It is as if the flow potential I'm traversed by is captured and siphoned a micro-instant before I've made a decision as to how to channel it. Once captured, the potential becomes the only given possible. It becomes the only present, clamping down on the open-endedness of futures. I no longer am the sum of all the potential that makes me into a not fully predictable horizon of possibility, both taken and non-taken. Instead, I become a selected quantification of that potential available for capture, my vital uncertainty eroded to the bone. But this is nothing new. It's not something that I come up with, absolutely, because already in the late 70s, French philosopher Jean-François Lyotard, in this great small essay, The Postmodern Condition, had already identified in the new unit of information, we are at the cusp of digital revolution, in the new unit of information, the bit, and in the translation of information into code, the fundamental issue whose full-blown impact we are experiencing now, the erosion of ambiguity. And Lyotard's reflection on the impact of computational knowledge are incredibly contemporary, so I will invite everybody to reread that book. How knowledge is produced and acquired has changed. And the point is not that it has become a tradable asset or monetized or commodified, because that's not new. What is new is the extent to which knowledge has become subsumed in algorithmic governmentality, and the extent to which what counts as knowledge has become automated. And on this ground, I'm going to ask this question. What if the philosopher most relevant to this age of automation and predictive analytics was not a contemporary theorist of AI, but the thinker writing at the beginning of the 20th century? Indeed, the most celebrated philosopher of his age. A philosopher who then also fell into decades of obscurity until Gilles Deleuze helped to herald his return in the late 60s. And of course, I'm talking about Henri Bergson. He is the most profound thinker of time. His ideas are original and provocatory and incredibly actual. And I just started to scratch the surface. So if there are Bergson scholars in the room, please forgive me. And there is an important reason why I offer you Bergson. Because all his work is concerned with understanding the continuous creation of unforeseeable novelty, which is something philosophy continues to struggle with, and in fact, not only philosophy, but human intellect as well. And there is a particular aspect of his work I'm going to concentrate now in the second part of my talk, which is a lecture he gave in September 1920 at the University of Oxford, which I discuss in my book actually in a footnote, and then I spent months trying to understand what was that lecture about. So it's September 1920, and this is one of the first international philosophical congresses after the devastation of the First World War. And in fact, English, French, and American philosophers were invited, but the German colleagues were still excluded. And the historical moment really matters because it's only less than 2 years from the end of the war, a war that Europe's political and intellectual systems failed to anticipate, failed to foresee. A catastrophe that shattered 19th century confidence in progress, in the futures, in rationality. Bergson at this moment is the most famous philosopher in Europe, if not the world, and is invited to deliver the opening lecture. And the title of his talk was Prediction and Novelty. Now, history remembers his talk with a different title, The Possible and the Real. And that's why Bergson was really meticulous. It often spent years and years rewriting his talks and reformulating his work. And this lecture remained unpublished for a decade. It appeared first in 1930 in a Swedish journal as part of his address for the Nobel Prize he got awarded for literature in 1927. And finally was published in French in 1934, so 14 years after. I should also say that Bergson was not simply a philosopher. He also played a really interesting, significant role in the reconstruction of the international intellectual life after the war, because in 1922 he became the founding president of the League of Nations International Committee on Intellectual Cooperation, the direct precursor to UNESCO, which was conceived as a vehicle for peace through intellectual exchange, bringing together figures such as Marie Curie, Einstein, scholars, artists, thinkers, to foster collaboration beyond the national borders. And of course, he also had a diplomatic role during the war, because it was sent by the French government to the States to lobby President Wilson to enter the war, which he did. Okay, what does he say in this lecture and essay? He advances a number of provocative ideas. He says that the possible does not pre-exist the real. That is the real which creates its own possibility. That the future cannot truly be predicted because genuine novelty emerges in time. And that no political, scientific, or logical system, no calculation can fully pre-contain the future, because the future is not already there waiting to be discovered, that the future is created. So not only is the future open, but is also radically unforeseeable. And this means that reality is not about charting a path through a multitude of options that get selected one after the other. Reality unfurls in all its sinuosities, writes Bergson, that cannot be calculated. But of course, this is not how we usually think, right? And Bergson is also surgically precise in analyzing and really demolishing the limitation of the human intellect and the ingrained habits of thoughts that prevent us from grasping this unfurling, from feeling these sinuosities, this openness, and this uncertainty. So before I proceed in analyzing and unpacking the possible and the real, I'm going to explain first what Bergson means by habit of thoughts, which for him derive always from badly presented problems. Now, as humans, we are driven by basic needs, usually defined by lack. We project, we anthropomorphize, we impose symbolic diagrams upon the movement of the real, upon those sinuosities, to make it more regular, more calculable, to grasp it. Our mind, writes Bergson, constantly seeks solid points of support and a substitute of the continuous with the discontinuous, movement with stability, tendencies and propensities with fixed points. And of course, we do this to cope, because reality is very complex. We do this to cope with the complexity of our lived experience, which is also made of this plethora of different rhythms and affect and different patterns of time, social time, biological time, psychological time, interacting with each other. So we break the complexity into segments to manage it, and also to obtain some functional responses. And this is okay, it is useful, it is necessary for practical life. But in doing so, we reduce the real to diagrams, often binary. For example, let's take the situation in which we feel we're facing an alternative between two options, A and B. We might even picture ourselves as traveling along a path, reaching the point where choice is supposed to be made, and then where we're called to decide between those two options. Something very familiar. Now, Bergson tells us that this diagram, even to postulate a branching of this kind, is a distorted view of time. Because this diagram is a very crude crystallization of something that is flowing. It emphasizes two options, A and B, as destination, giving them equal status, but cannot show those sinuosities of the real. So it's a fictional simplification that transforms movement and tendencies into inert states that we are imagining they're there, are waiting for our choice, as if we could choose A and then change our mind, retrace our steps, and find B waiting for us. But that's not true, because these destinations are not real. What is real are the tendencies towards them, the movements, but we constantly make them into static diagrams. And in fact, Bergson even writes, in reality, there are not two tendencies, not even two directions, but just the self, which lives and develops through its own hesitations, until free action drops off like an overripe fruit. He has these beautiful turns of language. He's the only philosopher that actually managed to make the writing liquid. So this is not about a choice between pre-given options, but the ripening of action in time. But why do we keep on falling in this habit of thoughts? And Bergson is quite stark in explaining this. He says it's because the intellect is characterized by natural inability to comprehend life. Okay? It's not mincing words. Our intellect struggles to comprehend movement and instead gravitates towards immobility. In fact, we build the very idea of movement by putting static things together. We fabricate reality by carving matter, and we use ready-made concepts as if they were a net with which we catch a discrete portion of the reality that is flowing through. But that's not how the cosmos works. And Bergson, in his surgical analysis, even tells us what are the most ingrained and persistent habits of thought, because he's a man on a mission. He really wants to change the way of thinking. And those habits are the habit of turning time into space, turning continuity into measurable segments, the habit of thinking about change as something that happens to static objects. But things, objects, are not static. We see them as discrete and self-contained, but they keep on flowing into each other. We may call them object things, atoms, bits, but they are just fugitive emanations. And most important for my discussion, and with this I'm going to come back to the possible and the real, the habit of thinking of the possible as something less than the real, as if the possible is that to which reality gets added in order to make it tangible. But this is an illusion, says Bergson. In the same way in which we think about nothing as the absence of something, and we think about chaos as the lack of order, when actually nothing is already something. It's just something that is irrelevant to us. And chaos is a kind of order we call disorder because it's not the order we want. And the possible is prevented from being real by something else which is real in its place. It is all these habits that create a breach into the sinuous fabric of time. And now the mechanism in relation to the possible works like this. Something happens, say a work of art, or also a life event. Once it exists, we look back and say, yes, it was possible all along. And we then imagine that this possibility somehow pre-existed the event itself. So we are locked into the idea that possibility comes before what is real, and that without the possible, there would be no real. And the implication of this is that we think of the future as the domain of the realization of the possible. But possibilities do not precede their realization, says Bergson. Why? Because this will mean to postulate a metaphysics in which everything is already given, as if future possibility were stored in a cabinet of possibles from which we can make our choices. And the future is nothing but the combination of what exists already. But this falsifies novelty, because if the future was already composed of ready-made possibilities, then nothing new could emerge. Example. Only after the Mona Lisa was painted, and Bergson uses the example of Hamlet, but this is a little bit more visually interesting. So only after the Mona Lisa was painted or Hamlet written, the possibility of these artworks happening can be contemplated. No possibility of Mona Lisa or Hamlet existed until they appeared. It's a little bit like a mental twist, isn't it? Once created, we imagine they were always possible, even though the very possibility was unimaginable until the thing happened. So what we call possibility, really, is a shadow cast by the present over the past. And that's because when we think about the possible, it's always from the vantage point of our present looking into the past. As a result of what has happened, Mona Lisa, Hamlet, me being here, the past has changed, containing now this logical possibility it did not have before. And this is how he explains it. As reality is created as something unforeseeable and new, its image is reflected behind it into the indefinite past. Thus, it finds that it has from all time been possible, but it is at this precise moment that it begins to have been always possible. The possible is therefore the mirage of the present in the past. And that is precisely the illusion. It is as if in seeing your reflection in the mirror, you figure that you could have touched it had you remained on the other side. That's the illusion produced by our intellect, our habit of thoughts. The laws call it a sleight of hand. It is a constant remodeling of the past by the present. Now, why I insist so much on this paper by Bergson is because I think that what is really teaching us is that when something happens, we know for a fact that it was possible for the thing to occur, but that does not equate to knowing what might possibly occur in the future. He puts it better than me when he writes, if you close the gate, you know no one will cross the road. It does not follow that you can predict who will cross when you open it. But I also insist on this paper, on this work by Bergson, because for me, the analysis he proposes in The Possible and the Real is fundamental for a radical rethinking of what futures can be. Because this mirage, this illusion that he described opposing the possible as what precedes reality, is nothing but the reduction to calculability of the unpredictability of the real. And this reduction has accelerated enormously since Bergson wrote, effectively curtailing our capacity of thinking the continuous creation of unforeseeable novelty, of thinking futures unbound to the present, futures diverging from the present. And now, if we begin to accept this critique of the possible and the real and our habit of thoughts, it's also about accepting Bergson's really distinctive and original concept of time, because for him, time is not an abstract entity, but it's the concrete experience of our inner life. It's a force that cannot be transposed in mathematical terms, because every time we measure it, we turn it into space. And in fact, we live as if time was space, even though it's not. And he calls this original definition of time as duration, the continuous, indivisible, subjective experience of time as a living thing. Now, to think in duration means to think in movement, to think in those sinuosities, to let go of discrete points. And the best example he offers is when we listen to a melody, where each note, a musical phrase, flows into the next. Philosopher Elizabeth Grost also captures duration very well when she writes that duration is the survival of a previous state in a successive one, the ceaseless movement of states through indiscernible transition. And we experience this all the time, but we experience this in particular every time we wait. And the example here is in waiting for sugar to dissolve in water, Bergson example. This waiting is duration, which also expresses the lack of alignment between my desire for a sweet drink and matter's own duration, in this case sugar and water, because their rhythms, their duration are different from mine, do not coincide with mine. Sugar and water own being are defined by their own duration, certain manner of persisting, enduring, and I have to wait. So the important consideration from this is that duration takes time. I must endure it before I get what I want or what I seek. Not everything is given at once. Time takes time. And duration means also to endure, to continue, which means continually changing because each moment will be different from the moment before. And at the core of this process is the uncertain leap into divergence. And the living being, says Bergson, essentially has duration. It has duration precisely because it is continuously elaborating what is new, and because there is no elaboration without searching, no searching without groping. Time is this very hesitation, or it is nothing. So what Bergson really insists is that lived time as duration is about change, is always this divergence between what was and what will be. Because everything proceeds by divergence, even if we'd like to imagine that is a growing acquisition or linear accumulation. And divergence is precisely what is constantly differing from itself. But also, what he's saying here is that this process is tentative, is a groping, is an hesitation, is a maybes. It's about being always in the middle of the unfurling of a tendency. Now, how can we use this consideration for our understanding of the future? Now, Bergson makes the future legible to us not as progression, but as what endures, diverges, and transforms itself constantly. But this really complicates our reading of the future because it asks us to shift from trying to understand, predict, anticipate, perhaps control, to grasp change, and not in terms of what we know already, but in the uncomfortable, difficult, and challenging terms of what we don't know. And if I keep on insisting on the unforeseen and the unplanned and the uncertain, it's not because of a naive disposition towards a novelty or surprise, or as an endorsement to embrace or celebrate uncertainty for its own sake or as a trigger to creativity. It's because of a commitment to a possibility that something genuinely new might emerge, something that exceeds the horizon of the present and cannot be reduced to its probabilities, projection, or existing conditions. But to do this, we must dislodge those habits of thoughts that reduce becoming to prediction and the future to a replication or extension of the present. And to do this, Bergson gives us some ideas, and for this it's important also to think about the moment in which he was writing again, because a great deal of his work was a response to what was happening at that time. It was a time that Jonathan Crary has described as the general standardization of experience and automation of perceptual response at the turn of the century. So this is the time roughly across 1890s and well into the 1930s of the emergence of new technologies. Cinema, wireless telegraphy, electrification, assembly line, radio, television, advertising. All technologies that generated the new forms of automatic perception, scripted behaviors, and in which pre-made images were passively consumed. And this was also the time of the emerging of social spaces increasingly saturated with sensory input. The street, the arcade, the department store, all those key markers of urban modernity, fostering new forms of technologically driven spectacular consumption. In parallel, a central problem of mainstream psychology at the time was the nature of attention. So problems of concentration, problems of focus, distraction, the relationship between stimulus and attention, because the sensorial saturation that was emerging and driven by new technologies prompted this very contemporary question. How many sources of stimulation could one attend simultaneously? And Bergson really reflected on this, on the impact of this intensified sensorium, making behavior increasingly routinized, making thoughts and decision-making process increasingly automated. He considered this a reduction of life to automatism and to mechanical reaction, to ready-made responses, sensory motor reflexes. And for him, this is the intrusion of the mechanical, by which he doesn't really designate the technology, but the erosion of complexity, the erosion of indeterminacy, the erosion of continuity. He writes that most of us exist as automata, acting out of inertia and the pressure of social conventions. And it is our habits of thoughts and social habits that prevent us from having an immediate contact with life. And he has a proposition. He has a suggestion of how we can interrupt the intrusion of the mechanical in order to reopen duration, to bring back hesitation. And with it the possibility that something new might emerge. And he calls it attention to life. This is about being in contact with reality, taking each situation as it is, not as a function of some overarching utility or instrumental logic. It is attention that makes us perceive continuity. Outward attention allows us to perceive people and things in their own singularity. Inward attention is about reclaiming motion, emotion, durations that compose our life. But this is not passive introspection or detached observation. It's active adjustment to reality. It's a deep tuning into reality, which allows us to grasp the coexistence of multiple duration, the simultaneity of the moth, the slug, and me talking. And of course, you might have noticed that this reverberates quite a lot with contemporary concerns around attention. The field of attention studies, it's really strong. But for Bergson, attention is not just the concentration or the erosion of cognitive focus. It's not about the allocation of a finite resource. Certainly it's not about paying attention. It is about grasping the coexistence of multiple duration through which we can enter indeterminacy, which ultimately for him equates with freedom. And this attention to life is a capacity that is the preeminent human capability, a mode of openness to reality, to expand our relation to the world and resist the narrowing. Because while automatic behaviors contract life, attention expands it. When attention loosens, we drift into mechanical behavior. But when attention intensifies, life becomes richer, more open, because it's more uncertain. And it is this elasticity that we want to cultivate. And we can do it by thinking backwards. The mind has to do violence to itself, he writes, has to reverse the direction of the operation by which it habitually thinks, has perpetually to revise, or rather to recast, all its categories. But in this way, we'll attain to fluid concepts capable of flowing reality in all its sinuosities and of adopting the very movement of the inward life of things. It is attention, therefore, that allows us to think backwards, because it allows memory to create our present anew, diverging from expectation, from established grooves, and instead of keeping on confirming known perception, it remakes perception. It opens up new pathways. And that's how we begin to conceive futures not already contained or given in the present, not preempted by the present, futures not known, but to be made, that erupt from the present. And this eruption, this leap, is what Elizabeth Gross calls radical politics of resistance, because it's a leap into the unknown that is a transformation of what in great dynamics and expectation are, and is a leap that renders the existing order unstable, insecure, and ultimately replaceable. But this can happen only if the present is not simply critiqued, but gets dislocated, gets fractured and cracked, because it is only in this way that the new can be invented, welcomed, and affirmed. So, concluding, that's what Bergson can teach us. Thinking backward, to stitch the breach of time and reclaim the uncertainty we need as an ally to live in time, to make futures different from the endless replication of the present. Today, in this age of algorithmic governmentality, the future is treated as something that can be modeled and optimized. Algorithmic systems operated through the metaphysical assumption that the future already exists in latent form as a field of calculable possibilities, waiting to be extracted, the wardrobe of possibility, the cabinet. This system spatializes time. They transform living processes into measurable units, metrics, dashboard, probabilities, scores. Duration becomes data. And this is precisely the logic Bergson critiques in the possible and the real, because lived experience is not discrete. It is durational. Rhythms, affect, memories, hesitation, desire, maybes. So Bergson gives us a philosophical vocabulary for resisting the reduction of life to calculability and capture, at a time when the condition of planetary computation are reactivating and magnifying questions that industrial modernity was already asking. He reminds us that the future is not a menu of options to choose from, but an open process of emergence and divergence. And that's where an allyship with uncertainty becomes necessary, not only as a resistance to ontological closure, but as one of the most urgent philosophical and political tasks available to us. The possible does not precede the real. Time is not the unfolding of what already exists or we know. Time is not its models, its diagrams or metaphors. Time invents. Time is real. Time hides within objects. Time takes time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Betti, for this inspiring collection of thoughts. You really open a lot of questions to us and raised our attention, definitely. Please, I would like to have a couple of questions from the public.
Thank you very much,
Thanks,
Betti.
guys.
And I'm just venturing to give people time to think of a better question than the one that I'm going to be asking. But I feel the urge to speak as a historian, who has engaged with social futures for about 10, 11 years. And I think there was a very interesting distinction you made in relation to seeing possibility as a shadow cast by the present onto the past. And I think there's something quite powerful about that. At the same time, what historians tend to do is to shed light on the past. So I guess the use of analogies are important to that extent. And so some of the work that I've done in relation to, for example, the transformation of Paris during the 19th century is to look at conflicting visions of the future in the past and how they change over time. That as possibilities, so possible futures in the past which remained unrealized, and the consequences of that process. So the question I have is, to me, the challenge would be, whenever we fix the possibility in the past, we also fix the relationship between the past, the present, and the future. And I think what you're claiming, and maybe I'm misreading the lecture, but maybe what you're claiming is that part of what we should do within anticipation studies, and perhaps more broadly, is to pose the challenge of how do we resist that temptation to fix that relationship so that it remains open, fluid, moving, and unchanging if we are to take Bergson's advice on this. So any response to that will be a fitting conversation which we can carry on later on as well.
Thank you very much for this beautifully posed question and observation, which contains already his answer. Because precisely that notion that it's possible to revisit and remanage, if you want, the way in which the trajectory past, present, into the future is read, is perceived. It's something that we have the capability to do. But the comment you made about history as the discipline that constantly sheds light into the past, it's very appropriate. It really makes me think of Carlo Ginzburg, who also recently passed. And my love for his work is precisely because he was able to constantly dig microhistory and revisit what had already happened in different ways, really extracting also not simply different reading, but different possibility of what the past futures could have been, would have been. Now, how can we do that? The only thing I could suggest is by cultivating the attention to propensities, the attention to understanding and seeing where things are about to go, the direction that things seems to be taking. And this is not an easy skill to cultivate, because it's about reading in the seed, and I'm misquoting some Chinese philosopher, reading in the seed the flower that it will become. And this is also what the work of François Julian really is about, cultivating the capacity to be attuned to the propensities in order to shift just a moment before things are turning.
Thank you very much, Riel Miller. Hi, folks. Just a question to connect to what Manuela was saying about design and paradox, to what you just evoked in terms of competency. And Manuela talked about changing the conditions of change, and I'm just thinking that perhaps there's a competency related to what you've been talking about that would provide an easier access to those seeds.
What would the easier access would be? Yeah.
Being able to see, attention.
Yeah.
So how do you cultivate attention?
How do you think we can cultivate attention? There are different, say, schools of thoughts. Bergson talks about being, and I'm probably vulgarizing his thought immensely, being so immersed in the present flow that there is no segmentation between the past, the present, and the future. But he also tells us that we are not designed in that way. So, is there anything that design can do to foster precisely this capacity? Because I've been thinking a lot about design and also design as an ontological force that creates the world, but also create expectations. And I'm always a bit conflicted when I hear design described as centered on the user, centered on object, centered on the human, or even the more than human. I'm just wondering whether design can be centered on uncertainty. Because ultimately, design is about the construction of the artificial. So the artificial is what could be otherwise, which is another definition of radical contingency. Can design be focused on potential? And I'm not using potential and uncertainty as a synonym, but I would like to see a potential-centered design, including the potential not to, which I can talk a little bit about if anybody's interested.
I think that we can leave further question for a more networking moment because we are actually already out of time and we have a strict schedule. But I want to thank very much Betti for her inspiration, and I wish you have more questions for her later on.
Thank you.